Hello, everybody. Wherever you are, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to another session of our African Epistemologies Advanced Seminar Series. My name is Sanya Usha, and on behalf of the Director of Humor, Dr. and Professor Divine Fo, I welcome you all to yet another session. Today we have a distinguished guest, distinguished philosopher who making waves in the African philosophy circles currently. He's the person of Dr. Aribiah David Attoe of the University of Witwatersrand here in South Africa. Dr. Attoe recently published a very important book, which is generating a lot of attention, critical reception within African philosophy circles, called Groundwork for a new kind of African metaphysics. He's a recipient of the Global Philosophy of Religion Project grant from the John Templeton Foundation in collaboration with the University of Birmingham. He's a member of the very important African philosophy movement called the School of Conversational Philosophy. He's also a member of the African Philosophy Society, in which he's been making important and sterling contributions. So I'm very delighted and honored to welcome you to this session of our African Epistemologist series. Welcome, David. Like I mentioned in our brief chat before the talk, you'll be allowed to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, after which we would have a Q&A. I look forward to a very interesting session. Welcome. Thank you so much for honoring our invitation at such a short notice. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Prof. Sanya, for your very kind introduction. Permit me to share my slides. I hope everyone can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So today I have the very difficult task of presenting an overview of this very interesting book in about 25 to 30 minutes, which would be very difficult, but I'll try my best to keep to time to allow for Q&A. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is provide some sort of a brief overview where I gloss over some of the major ideas contained in this book. I'll first start with my motivations as to why I wrote the book, and then talk about some of the major ideas that I present in the book. All right. All right, so the book is a book about African metaphysics, and the job of every metaphysician, whether the person is an African metaphysician or a European or an American metaphysician or a metaphysician from any other tradition, is that your job is to unveil the fundamental nature of reality. And it's a very difficult task. Now, when you want to unveil the fundamental nature of reality, you want to get at the truth of the nature of reality. The problem here is that getting at absolute truth is very difficult. So what we have are various stories about the nature of reality, and some stories are more plausible than the other. And I, in this book, try to present a plausible story of reality from an African perspective. And much of my views draw from the views of anonymous traditional African philosophers, so named by Innocent Asuzu. to describe those philosophers whose ideas we still find in the literature, but whose names are lost in history. And so he calls them the anonymous traditional African philosophers. Now, for much of African metaphysics, what you normally see in the literature is mostly a re-echoing of the ideas of these traditional African metaphysicians. You find this in various ethnophilosophical work. And it was not I think there's a problem with my network. So I'll just continue from where I stopped. So much of the literature in African metaphysics is basically a re-echoing of these traditional African ideas. And it wasn't until recently that the works of individuals like Mogobe Ramose, Innocent Asuzu, Jonathan Chimakonam, Adagada, that you begin to see new ideas in African metaphysics, ideas that push the boundary. And so for me, what was more important, rather than re-echoing all these traditional ideas, what was my concern was pushing the boundaries of African metaphysics and trying to forge a new path in African metaphysics. And that is what I tried to do in this book. And so in the book, the starting point is the concept of God. Now, African metaphysicians have thought of God in various ways, whether as an absolute being with various omni-properties such as omnipresent, omniscient, all good, all knowing, all powerful, and the likes, or as a limited God, that is a God that doesn't possess all these absolute properties that we are used to. And so God is not all powerful because God is only a being with power and glory, according to Adagada. God is not all good because according to scholars like Babajide Dasaolu and John Bewaji, God is capable of creating evil, and so on and so forth. But in these two ideas, the idea is that God is a personalized entity, an entity that is conscious, that has some sort of subjective experience. But the question that I have for philosophers who think this way is, how do we come about this knowledge? Why do we think that God possesses all these properties that we think he does? Why do you think God is a conscious entity? Why do you think God has a personality? When we do not have a full understanding or a full grasp of the nature of God. And in fact, we are not even sure if God exists. If we are unsure of all these things, then we cannot know for certainty that God possesses all these attributes that we claim that God possesses. So what I did in the book was dismantle our notions of God and try to build an understanding of God based on logic, on logical necessity. And so in my vision of God, I vision God to be a material first cause. Based on the idea from Wiredu's work, where he describes the impossibility of nothingness, that idea necessitates the existence of an at least regressively eternal entity that is the first cause from which all other entities emanate from. And so that's my first attribute that I attribute to God. And I think that God is also material. And my idea of material is anything that is capable of interacting with other aspects of reality, any other aspect of reality. I consider that thing to be material. And if God is the creator, if other things in the world emerge from God, then God must also be material because these things have a relationship with God and God has a relationship with all these other aspects of reality that emerge from it. And I also think of God as unconscious and not as an intentional creator, because I think creation itself does not demand the existence of a conscious entity or an intentional entity. The reason I think so is because in my view, creation involves the emergence of a new state of affairs. Now, the emergence of a new state of affairs does not need to involve a conscious entity. It just has to involve entities that exist and which entities that have relationship with each other. That's all you need for a new state of affairs to emerge. And if creation involves the creation of a new state of affairs, then God does not need to be conscious for a new state of affairs to emerge. And because of the nature of God, I think that God is responsible for the way the world is today just by merely existing in the way that it existed as the first cause. And it's in this sense that I think of God, or I talk of my philosophy as a predeterministic philosophy, because I believe that without God existing the way it did, the world that we see today will not exist the way that we see it today. Now, moving on to God, I also talked about the notion of being in my work. The question of being in metaphysics usually involves two things. First of all, it involves what it means to exist, and then it involves the fundamental nature of that reality that exists. And for me, what it means to exist is to be in a relationship with other existence realities in the world. All right. And of course, that ties to my definition of material. And that is why, for me, the universe is exclusively material in its makeup. So for a thing to exist, it must have a relationship with other things in the world. It must constitute a missing link of reality, as Innocent Asuzu likes to say. And that's different from being seen to exist. To be seen to exist demands or requires the existence of a conscious mind, such as the human mind. And I believe that the idea, the concept of existence is basically a category of the mind. It is not a property of things in the world. Now, regarding the question of the nature of reality, I agree with Asuzu's idea that the bifurcation of being is problematic, especially in the works of philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. So Asuzu goes on this long critique of Plato and Aristotle on the basis of their bifurcation of reality. So for instance, Plato talked about the world of forms versus the world that we live in, which is a copy of the world of forms. Aristotle in his metaphysics talked about accidents and substance or essences. And what ties these two philosophies together is the tendency to neglect one aspect of reality in favor of the other one. So there is no need to talk about a copy of the world of forms when you can talk about the world of forms itself, when you can try to understand the world of forms. You cannot talk about what a thing is in itself by merely looking at accidental properties alone. But you can know what a thing is by looking at the essential properties of that thing, by understanding the essential components of that thing. You know, so for instance, what would constitute my hair, for instance, might constitute an accidental property, because shaving off my hair or not shaving off my hair does not change who I am essentially, right? So in these two philosophies, you see that it is possible to discard one aspect of being in favor of another aspect of being. And that raises lots of social problems that Asuzu goes into, and which I wouldn't go into because of time. And so what Asuzu does is tone down this bifurcation of being by saying, well, there are things that are important in the world, in being, right? And there are things that are more important. In that way, you are unable to discard any aspect of reality, because for him, everything serves as a missing link of reality. But I disagree with Asuzu, not because he toned down the bifurcation of being, but because he also introduced the same bifurcation he was trying to avoid through the back door by insisting that there are things that are important and there are things that are more important or most important, in his words. So for me, if you break down reality into its various component parts, you reach a point where you come to the fundamental units of reality. And so similar to Democritus's atom, I conceive that fundamental unit of reality to be what I call singular realities. And it is the relationality between singular realities and other realities that give birth, that the conglomeration of these singular realities that give birth to new things in the world. And these things also interrelate with themselves in certain ways to create much more complex beings or much more complex realities. And so rather than say their essential components and their accidental components of being, or saying that they are important components of being and more important components of beings, I say in my philosophy that they are just singular realities which interrelate and conglomerate to form being. That's my vision of being. And this is based on my notion of causality. So in much of African philosophy or African metaphysics, the idea of causality is one that reflects a top-down relationship between spiritual agents and certain forms of effect. So for instance, when an individual is walking under a tree and a fruit hits him on the head and he dies, it is not enough for most African metaphysicians to merely say this individual's death was as a result of a fruit falling on his head, for instance. There must be a reason why it was that individual at that particular time. Why him and no other person? Why is it that other people who have had fruits fall on their head, why have they not died? Why this particular person? And the answer to that why question is usually some spiritual agent or some spiritual entity. So whether it's witchcraft, whether it's malevolent spirits, whether it's some action the individual had committed in the past that had led to this unfortunate incident. All these things are plausible explanations within the traditional African perspective. Another explanation would be what one might call the World Wide Web view. And this has nothing to do with the internet. It is merely the view that everything in the world is interconnected in some way. And so when something happens, when there is an effect in some other aspect of reality, it also has an effect on another aspect of reality by the mere fact that they are interconnected. All right, but in my book, I propose that the idea of causality is based on what I call interactive relationships. And these interactive relationships encompass the totality of relationships that exist in a particular state of affairs. So if you want to say that A causes B, or to say that anything causes B, you must take into cognizance the state of affairs that preceded the existence of B, or the existence of that effect. You must take into cognizance all the relationships that exist in that previous state of affairs. And even in the emergence of a new state of affairs, which is the effect you call B, you must also take into cognizance the relationship between B and previous states of affairs. And it is by considering this relationship that you have a full understanding of the causal relationships that brought B into being. That is my idea of causality. All right. And if that is true, if a previous state of affairs necessarily leads to newer state of affairs, if that is how the causal chain links itself, then you must admit to a rigid form of determinism, and it is something that I admit to in my work. So determinism is not new in African metaphysics, although it is not talked about much. So for instance, in discussions of destiny in the Yoruba tradition, which you'll find in the works of people like Segun Badagesi, there's hints at determinism in that view. Even Kwame Gyekye briefly discusses determinism. Adagada's consolationism is based on determinism. Even Jonathan Chimakonam's and Loki Ogunaya's cognonormative epistemology is deeply deterministic in my reading of it. But despite all these views, there seems to be a deep desire by philosophers, not just African philosophers, but philosophers generally, to admit to some sort of compatibility between freedom and determinism. There's this deep desire for choice, and the reason for this is quite obvious. The reason for this is because we feel that without free will, we are nothing. And I say this in the book. I say the egotism attached to notions of free will is confounding. It is almost as if our self-worth is tied to the denial of determinism. And this is an intuition that Robert Nozick also has, apart from all these African philosophers I mentioned. He says that it seems like determinism belittles the human being, it diminishes us. And so we find out that even in all these discussions about determinism in African philosophy, there's still insert free will, the ability to choose in all these philosophies. So for instance, in the Yoruba conception of destiny, there's a view that destinies are alterable, or that you can choose to pursue your own destiny. In Kwame Ejechia's work, he says there's determinism in the world, but that determinism does not affect the human being for one reason or the other. I don't find that argument plausible. Even Jonathan McConnell's cognonormative theory, where he suggests that knowledge influences human actions in a very total way, he still leaves the option of choice when it comes to suicide. As if the motivation for suicide does not come from our knowledge of the world. So there's this determination amongst philosophers to include free will in their philosophies, even though determinism stares them very starkly in the face. But in the book, I am not interested in any false sense of worth that we might have as human beings. I'm more interested in where the arguments lead, and the arguments lead to a predeterminism, which I take to its logical conclusion. And so in my arguments for determinism, I make some claims. So I say, for instance, that randomness and chaos are just illusions of the mind. So when we do not focus our minds on certain events in the world, we think that they are random, we think that they are chaotic. It is only when we focus our intellectual gaze at that particular event that we begin to see the causal linkages that led to the eventuality of that state of affairs, and that immediately removes the idea that those events are random or chaotic. I also say that there's also the illusion that a cause is not an effect in itself. So when we say that A causes B, we forget that A in itself is an effect and not just a cause. We just imagine that A is a standalone cause that creates a new effect, which is B. But A itself is an effect, which another cause is responsible for. And you can go on and on and on until you get to the first cause, which is God. All right, so the idea that certain causes are causes in themselves is not true. They are also effects. And there's also the idea of a dislinked effect, what I call a dislinked effect, which is the idea that we can actually make choice, free choice. I think that is impossible. The reason why I think that is impossible is that for such a thing to be metaphysically possible, you would be creating something that is not relationally linked with any other thing in the world. I think that is impossible as per my philosophy, because we as human beings do not have the power to create such entities that are not causally linked or relationally linked to any other thing in the world. So if that is true, if all these ideas are plausible, then free will is impossible. There's no free will in the world. And if there is no free will in the world, then we must go the extra mile and deny the idea of responsibility. So when we say someone is responsible for a certain action, that cannot be true, because what influences an individual to commit or to perform a certain action is a previous state of affairs, whatever that might be. All right. So if Cain killed Abel, it is not because Cain chose to kill Abel. There are many factors that influence Cain to kill Abel. So for instance, God's rejection, anger issues, his mood at the time, many other things influence, many other previous state of affairs influence the new state of affairs, which is Cain killing Abel. So it is impossible to lay blame. It is impossible to say that Cain is himself responsible for his actions. So we must remove the idea of responsibility from our vocabulary. What we can do, however, is understand that certain feelings we have towards certain actions we consider evil, which is really actions that do not serve our own self-interest. Are natural. There are states of affairs that emerge from a previous state of affairs, right? So if you feel anger towards someone who stole from you, for instance, that is an effect. That is a new state of affairs that came about from a previous state of affairs, which is being stolen from. But that has nothing to do with saying that that individual is responsible for his actions or not responsible for his actions, as the case may be. So if we must admit that free will is impossible, then we must reject the idea of responsibility. And I do that in my book. And so finally, in the book, I discuss what it means to die, what's my notion of death based on the idea of predeterminism. So in African philosophy, there is a suggestion that death is some sort of transition from this physical world to the spiritual world, where one becomes an ancestor and all that. And you become an ancestor by living a meaningful life as an individual, dying and transitioning to become an ancestor, and then continuing to live a meaningful life by, positively influencing the lives of those you've left behind. Once you do that, and once you're continually remembered by the community, according to people like John Beatty and Ifeanyi Nkiti, then you continue to become an ancestor. So death, within the African view, is just a transition from one type of existence to another type of existence. Existence as a human being to existence as an ancestor or a spirit or things like that. The more secular view is that death entails some irreversible brain death and bodily decay. So once you have brain death, then the individual is dead, insofar as that brain death is physically irreversible. But within the context of predeterminism, predeterministic historicity, which is what I call my view, death only implies a transformation from one material form to another material form. In a discussion with one of my students in class, he quite rightly pointed out to me that within the context of my metaphysics, it is impossible for things to totally go out of existence. You can only have a transformation from one form of existence to another form of existence, one form of material existence to another form of material existence. And that is what death is, by and large. And at the same time, death also implies nothingness. By nothingness, I mean the total loss of subjective experience. Now, we can talk about a total loss of subjective experience because subjective experience itself is captured within the context of particular brain states. So when you die and your brain begins to decay, you lose your subjective consciousness. And so you are plunged into nothingness. But then again, your body transforms from one form to another and continues to relate with other aspects of the world. For example, worms, bacteria, and things like that become manure for foliage, things like that. Sometimes you might become meat for animals and things like that. So you're just transformed from one form of existence to another, and you begin newer types of relationships, while at the same time losing your subjective experience. That's what it means to die within the context my philosophy. So far, I hope I've been able to present a brief overview of some of the ideas I have put down in the book. I am sure some of you have burning questions to ask me, and I am willing to answer all your questions, and I look forward to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for such a very rigorous philosophical presentation. It's quite intense. I'm very happy with the standard, very, high level. I'm hoping that we'll get enough questions that will challenge you even more from the audience. So I'd open up the floor to the audience for comments, reactions, and engagement with David's really stimulating presentation. Anybody who's willing to go first, you should just indicate by a show of hand. Is anybody willing to go? Lucky, are you ready to go? No, if you're not ready, fine. Okay, should I abuse my position? Can I abuse my position, David?
Well, sure you can. Sure you can.
Okay, thank you so much once again for your presentation. I'm very impressed by the very engaging way you've dealt with the branch of philosophy called metaphysics. It's not something that is often done in this day and age. Now, I wanted to know why this engagement at this time, when after, for instance, the Nietzsche announced the death of metaphysics, so did Heidegger, the death of metaphysics. The entire idea of deconstruction, Derrida, is to say the death of metaphysics. We've gone beyond metaphysics, not a valid or viable branch of philosophy anymore in this day and age. That's one. Secondly, my other comment and question is linked to the preceding one, which is also in an age of transhumanism, when even the question of what we understand by the human subject has become quite contested. How do we, is it still appropriate to pose the kind of question you posed, the philosophical questions you posed? How valid is it in an age of transhumanism when, for instance, you have the imbrication of AI in human affairs and is changing the landscape of what we consider to be human? So yes, those are my questions for now. It's just to challenge you. Thank you so much also for once again for your very stimulating, very energetic presentation, very rigorous. But I'm hoping that you'll be able to respond to me. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Prof. Sanya. Perhaps Western metaphysics is dead. Maybe, I don't think so. But African metaphysics is very much alive. I think African metaphysics is really in its feral stage. I think it is important for African metaphysicians, African philosophers, to add their voice in the understanding of what reality is, the nature and fundamental nature of reality. I think it's very important. I don't think African metaphysics is dead. I think it's only just beginning to have new life. I think answering the big questions of the world, especially with the emergence of things like quantum mechanics and things like that, I think it is important to ask these big questions and try to provide answers to these big questions, provide systems that answer these big questions, tell our own stories, about all these ideas and questions that we have as philosophers. So I think African metaphysics is not dead. With regards to your question on transhumanism, I think that's a very difficult question. I did not consider, for instance, the nature of the human being strictly in this particular book, although it is something that I hope to consider in the future. And so the transhumanist question that you asked, it's difficult for me to answer that question now. I think it's a very difficult question. I think I'm trying to see how that question relates to the grand metaphysical system that I'm trying to build. Perhaps you can say more on that, and then I'll be able to respond. But I've not put down an answer to the question of the nature of the human being specifically. So I'm trying to understand where your question is coming from, and then I'll be able to give a reply. Perhaps you can say more on it.
No, I don't want to further abuse my position. I think somebody has indicated, Vitumbiko. I'm sorry if I murdered your name. I'm sure I did. I'm sorry, but
no, actually, that's it.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, you wanted to ask a question or make a give us a comment rather, whichever. Thank you.
All right, it's just a simple question. Thank you, Doctor, for the nice presentation. I think towards the end, there was a statement that death could imply nothingness in terms of subjective experience. So I was just thinking, how do we meaningfully say something like ancestors are happy or ancestors are angry in a way that we seem to attribute experience to ancestors if death means the absence of that? Yeah.
Well, the simple answer to that question is that we cannot plausibly make the claim ancestors are happy or ancestors are not happy, or whatever claims you want to make about ancestors. Mainly because within my philosophical or metaphysical system, ancestors do not exist in the way that you think they do. There are no subjective beings in some spiritual realm that we call ancestors. They don't exist in my metaphysics. We can't even make such claims such as ancestors are happy or not, because we don't even understand the nature of ancestors in the first place. We have no real logical or experiential knowledge of what ancestorhood means. And so if we have no such knowledge, really, we cannot make claims, plausible claims about their mental states. We can't even make plausible claims about the mental states of other people unless they relate that to us or we make good guesses, more so in entities that we have no knowledge of, really. So when someone says an ancestor is happy, either the person is making a false claim or the individual is projecting her own feelings on some entity that really does not exist in my metaphysical system or in the story that I am trying to tell in my philosophy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that response. And the question, thank you so much. Any more questions, comments, reactions to the presentation? Okay, since there are no, I'd clarify my earlier question, which you said you didn't understand, about the question of the human subject, because the imbrication of technology into our affairs, the question of presence has become quite expansive, it's become extended. It's the presence through, for instance, activities, on the web, and through technology, through how we create communities, how we create conviviality, how we create mutuality, how we create reciprocity. So a lot of activities as human beings have become quite complex because of the advancement in technologies and the way in which we relate to one another that has changed the terrain of human relationships and how we consider this, how we define ourselves, how we define friendship, how we do, it's just so much more complex. So in view of that, what do you think such developments would have on the field of metaphysics? Is it time we consider a new kind of metaphysics that would take in all these new developments that are, changing the question of what we mean by when we say human subject? That's what I mean.
Oh yes, I think you're perfectly right. So, like I said in the beginning of the work, apart from a few metaphysicians that I mentioned, people like Ramose, Asuzu, Chimakonam, Ogbonnaya, Adagada, who is here. Apart from some of these philosophers, especially the members of the conversational school of philosophy, much of African metaphysics has been backward looking, like I said, looking at the past. And there's nothing wrong with that, really. Re-echoing pre-colonial ideas, right? Very rarely building on them or extending them. What I have done in the book and what colleagues in the conversational school have done before me, and what colleagues and the elders like Mogobe Ramose have done and Asuzu have done, is try to incorporate new ideas into African metaphysics. In my particular book, I have tried to incorporate certain ideas that are, based on, neuroscientific knowledge in building my metaphysics. So, for instance, my idea of death, my idea of subjective experience is based on usually significantly based on neurophilosophical ideas, right? And I think for future research and research by other colleagues in metaphysics, it is important to incorporate all these other emerging aspects of reality. We are now talking about artificial intelligence systems. What does that mean for instance, for the hierarchy of beings in African metaphysics? Where do you put artificial intelligence systems? Are they above human beings or below human beings, and why? Would you consider them human, given our understanding of what being human means? How does social media, for instance, does it enhance relationality? What does that mean for human beings who are, according to most African philosophers, essentially relational? Does it enhance humanity, for instance? So I think, like you said, incorporate. I think it's important for African metaphysicians to incorporate some of these ideas into their metaphysical thinking, and I hope they do, and I will try to do so myself. So I think you're right. This is important for metaphysicians to incorporate these ideas you're talking about, or these new developments you're talking about.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We have a number of questions for you now. Now this session is really going to get even livelier, much more heated. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. We're very honored that you can be here. So we'll take Jonathan first, then we'll go to Gideon, and Amara will be next, and the third one. Jonathan, please ask your question or make your comment. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sanya, and thank you, Dr. Aribiah David, for that wonderful, brief, and sharp presentation. I enjoyed it. My question is rather simple. I hope it is simple. I am enthused by your conception of God. Yes. But my question is, a God that's been stripped of all spiritistic accretions, is that entity still a God? And how does what is left after you've stripped it of its traditional spiritistic qualities? How does that represent, a kind of idea that Africans would subscribe to when they conceive of God? Thank you.
Could you repeat the second part of your question? The line broke off for a bit.
Okay, so the second part of the question is, when you have stripped God of all of its spiritistic qualities, let me use that word, spiritistic qualities, as you have done in your theory of predeterministic historicity, whatever that is left, is it something that Africans, because predeterministic historicity is supposed to be a theory in African philosophy, whatever that is left, is this something that people would say represents, even if, partially, an idea of God by Africans? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your question. I believe that the first part of your question is, if you strip God of all these properties, that entity still God? Well, perhaps if you consider a first cause as God, then you would consider that entity as God. If you're thinking of God in terms of entities that has certain magical powers, certain aspect of it that are superlative and statistic, like I said, then such an entity does not exist. Whether that would appeal to African philosophers or Africans themselves remains to be seen. But then I think the more crucial question is, which is more plausible? Because remember, like I said in the beginning of my talk, for most metaphysicians, when you're trying to discover the fundamental nature of reality, you're not going to, what you want to do is get at the nature of things, the truth of the matter, rather than trying to see how your ideas mirror ideas from the past. So the question I would then pose to African philosophers would be, what type of God would you rather believe in? Would you rather believe in a God of your ancestors, for which no real, we have no real experiential or logical understanding of that God, and so cannot make any plausible claims of that God? Is that the God that we want to believe in? Do we want to believe a God of our wishful thinking? Or do we want to believe a God that at least has some of these minimum properties that we can plausibly defend? For me, I would choose the latter rather than the former. So it depends on the answer that African philosophers have to that question that I have just posed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. If my good friend Sanya would allow me to follow up, I am getting excited.
Sorry,
thank you very much, Sanya.
I have to crave your indulgence. Sorry, we're just running out of time. I was going to tell Gideon and Amara to just speak very briefly, so that he
okay. So I hands off. Let them take their turn. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sir. Okay, so Gideon, you have to be extremely brief. We just have 4 minutes left. So, and I know it's difficult to confine yourself to that, but please will be very brief. And also Amara, quite brief as well. And so we can allow our speaker to respond the way he can to your question. So Gideon, please, can you go?
Thank you very much, Dr. Aribiah. My question is on what position do humans occupy in your hierarchy of beings in this world, especially with the way you've defined God? Because at least from the Christian tradition, let's say humans are important because God created us in his image. So now with this God that you have said there that doesn't even have consciousness, what significance does that hold for the status of humanity? in the scheme of reality.
Okay, so just briefly, I don't have a hierarchy of being in my metaphysics as of now, and I don't think I plan to have one. But to answer your question, human beings are not very important within this my metaphysical scheme. We are just fleeting beings in the world that would eventually transform into other beings that are not human beings. We would decay into the world, and the world will move on like we never existed. So the value we place on human beings is, for the most part, misguided, at least within the context of my metaphysical scheme.
Thank you. Amara, your turn.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Aribiah. My question is this: please, could you throw more light on your idea of predeterministic historicity, and how does it differ from the mainstream Western idea on determinism? Thank you.
All right, so first of all, it emerges from my unique vision of God. It also hinges on my idea of being, which is based on Asuzu's idea of complementarity. It is based on my notion of causality that I have now christened interactive relationality, all of which is different from what you would find in the Western view. Perhaps Jonathan, I think we have 2 minutes, so Jonathan can perhaps follow up very briefly.
That's true. Yeah. Go ahead, Jonathan, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I remember what I wanted to ask, but again, another idea has cropped into my head. You said, which God would we want to worship? The one that our ancestors worship that is so distant?
Which God would we want to believe in?
Or the one that we can defend, with arguments, objective arguments, or something quite close to our being. Personally, I think I'd like a believer in God would want that God to be as distant as possible, because that is what provides the aura of Godship. If a God that is so close is a God that you could get angry one day and wrestle with, okay? And when you pray to that God and things don't come to fruition, you could get so offended and you wrestle with that God and beat it down. So I prefer a God that is so distant. How do you respond to that?
We can have, so there's what I always refer to as wishful thinking. We can wish all we want. We can wish that flying horses existed and that they could grant us this flying horse can magically insert 2 million rands into our account. That is fine. We can wish all we want or imagine all we want. But the truth of the matter is such beings do not exist. That is why one can pray to God for healing and all these other things and then still die off of that same sickness. That is why we can pray, for instance, for elections to be in our favor, and then the people that we do not want end up being in power. The reason that is the case is because no such being, the beings that we imagine or we think that exist or that we wish to exist, no such being exists. So when you take such a being seriously and you begin to, base your life and, try to pray to or worship such a being, you end up having problems. You begin to see what Albert Camus calls the absurd, the fact that what you wish does not reflect what is. And I think you fall into bigger problems when you try to engage in such wishful thinking. That would be my response to you, Dr. Jonathan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for this rigorous presentation. We'll be watching very keenly how your book continues to make impact and waves. We wish it a very, very enjoyable, very productive career, and then I hope it generates more debates and more questions and more responses. Congratulations on it. I'm very happy about it, and also thank you for joining us today. Like I said, short notice. I know you're very busy in terms of promoting the book and everything. So we hope to see you again soon. We thank our audience for being very lively and very engaging, for your useful questions and comments. We thank everybody for coming, and hope to see you again quite soon. Sometime later next month, we'll have another session, and when we'll send you invites and notices about other upcoming events. And so we hope to engage with you more. Thank you so much for your time and your generosity.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.